Today, Monday, 15th January, is the day when, according to various reports that we've seen on Ukrainian Telegram channels, the British Ministry of Defence and the British intelligence services have been warning Ukraine that the Russians are supposed to begin their big offensive of the winter. Now, lots of reports about this. I expect to express some skepticism about it. I thought that it was much more likely that when the big Russian offensive begins, it will be significantly later this year. It didn't seem to me that the Russians were gearing up for a big offensive of the kind that the British were talking about this winter, specifically in Kharkov region or along the entirety of the front line. Instead, as I've discussed in many programs now, I think that the Russian strategy this winter remains one of aggressive attrition, of attacking the Ukrainians all along the front lines, keeping them busy, pinned down, forcing them to deploy their reserves, conducting further attrition upon them. And it seems to me more likely, much more likely, that that remains the Russian plan for this winter. The Ukrainians still have significant forces in being. They're still agonizing about whether or not to press forward with their mobilization plans. Opinion polls in Ukraine are showing more and more Ukrainians hostile to the idea of a general mobilization, but those plans do still exist. So all of that continues to go on in Ukraine. And I think until the Ukrainian forces have been weakened further, until the battlefield has been shaped further through the capture of places like A50, perhaps Joseph Yar, conceivably Kupiansk as well, I think that the Russians will continue with their present strategy, which continues to work for them. Anyway, I just mentioned this because, as I said, there's been a lot of discussion about this 15th January date in the Ukrainian media. I want to stress again that nothing that any Russian official has said refers in any conceivable way to any sort of offensive. I spoke about a week ago about Defense Minister Shoigu's latest statements to the Russian military leadership. He spoke there about active defense, described in a fairly detailed way what I said was the policy of aggressive attrition, of depleting Ukrainian forces. He did not talk about an offensive, a general offensive this winter. But anyway, we will see. I predict, by the way, that if we do not get a big offensive from the Russians this winter, the British Ministry of Defence will at some point do what they did last winter, which is claimed that the Russian winter offensive has been unsuccessful. By the way, let me reiterate a point I have made many times. There was a winter offensive by Russia last winter, and it was successful. It eventually resulted in the capture of Bakhmut. And it always puzzles me that people ignore that particular offensive, which did admittedly only capture a small amount of territory, though Bakhmut is a fair-sized town of about 70,000 people before the war, but which did inflict massive damage on the Ukrainian military as part of that policy of aggressive attrition I've been talking about, as American officials have been admitting for many months now. So just to keep that in mind and to remember, as I said, that what the Russians are doing on the battlefronts is consistent very much with the statements of Russian officials. And if we do start getting stories about a major Russian offensive this winter, which supposedly didn't come off, well, we should know better. Anyway, that is not the big story today. We're not hearing any reports today about big Russian offensives on the 15th of January. The big story today, at least the one that you will find all over the place in the Ukrainian media, in the Western media, the Financial Times is reporting Ukrainian claims about this without, the titles suggest that they are entirely true. Anyway, the big story today is that the Ukrainians have supposedly managed to shoot down two very advanced Russian, they're called spy planes, a Beriev A50 AWACS aircraft and an IL22, both of which supposedly were flying over the Sea of Azov. And in fact, we've had General Zelensky coming forward. He's provided what he says is evidence of this shoot down. This is the pictures of the radar traces of these two aircraft, and then the radar traces disappear, and he asks us to believe that this is proof that these two important aircraft have indeed been shot down. Now, a few hours later, the Kremlin actually commented on this story. And I'm going to read what the official Russian news agency, TASS, has to say about this story. And it is as follows. Kremlin has no information about Ukrainian forces shooting down Russian aircraft. And then the report goes on to say the Kremlin has no information about the downing of Russian planes by Ukrainian armed forces, presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters. Commenting on Kiev's claims about the alleged downing of the Russian A-50 and IL-22 aircraft, Peskov said, "No, there is no such information." And then he went on to say, according to TASS, besides, after all, this is an issue that concerns the course of the special military operation. And according to TASS, he then recommended that this information be clarified with the Russian Defense Ministry. Now, that is not a clear-cut denial, but it amounts to one. Peskov is saying that the Kremlin, presumably that means Putin himself, have no information. There is no such information about two valuable aircraft like an A50 AWACS aircraft and an IL-22 being shot down. That's what Peskov is saying. And his qualification that, this is something you need to talk about with the Russian Ministry of Defense, it seems to me that is consistent with Peskov's general practice, that whenever he gets asked specific, particular questions about the course of the special military operation, he tends to shuffle them off to the Ministry of Defense, which, by and large, observes a sphinx-like silence about Russian losses, very occasionally when it's impossible to deny them, as for example happened when the cruiser Moskva was hit and sank last May. Very occasionally, the Russian Defense Ministry comments about events of this kind. Mostly they don't. They've said absolutely nothing about this incident at all. But as I said, it is the routine practice of Peskov to bat information, claims of this kind, to the Defense Ministry, preserving the fiction that the Kremlin is dealing only with political matters, and that the operational side of what goes on the battlefronts is exclusively a question for the military. And I'm going to suggest that this is why we have this slightly equivocal response. Instead of Peskov simply saying, no, no such planes were shot down, he says, no, there is no such information, which is his way of slightly distancing himself from the story, because this is a story which, by some kind of agreement between the Kremlin and the Defense Ministry, it ought to be the Defense Ministry that is handling. But the fact that this question was asked at all, and I'm going to guess that the kind of question that Peskov gets is probably one that either he knows is coming or that has been planted in some way, or maybe I'm wrong about that. The very fact that the question was asked at all makes me wonder whether, in fact, what Peskov is trying to say is that there is no actual truth to this story. He's not going to encroach on the prerogatives of the Defense Ministry by saying that. But I am fairly sure that if two aircraft like an Beriev A50 AWACS and an Ilyushin-22 had indeed been shot down, then the Kremlin would certainly have been informed. And if Peskov says that they have no information about this, then, as I said, the strong likelihood is that these two aircraft have not been lost, and that this is what Peskov is saying. I would add that even if this was a question put by, let us say, a Western reporter, not a planted question, is that Peskov could in that case have said, it's nothing to do with me. Why don't you ask the Russian Defense Ministry about it? Again, the fact that he's saying, no, there is no such information, again suggests to me that he's conveying the message that these two aircraft were not shot down. However, it is not as straightforward as this. And we had more reports about this from the Russian side. And it does now increasingly look as if the Ilyushin-22 at least has not been shot down, because apparently there are pictures circulating of it landing in Russia at its base. And there's also reports, by the way, accumulating reports that the same is true of the Beriev A50, that it too has landed at its base. But the reports also claim that both aircraft are damaged, and there is pictures appearing of what is supposed to be the fin of the Ilyushin-22, and you can see that it is scoured by what could be either bullet holes or shrapnel holes. I'm not someone in any position to comment one way or the other. Now, that has led some people in Russia to suggest that this was a friendly fire incident. The Russians have had repeated problems with friendly fire. Even Putin, some weeks ago, complained that that identification friend and foe equipment doesn't always work very well. It's been pointed out that these two aircraft were operating over the Sea of Azov. This has been generally acknowledged by pretty much everyone. It's also been claimed that Ukraine lacks air defense missiles capable of attacking, with range of attacking Russian aircraft operating over the Sea of Azov. It's also been suggested that the idea that fighter jets, Ukrainian fighter jets, might have been involved in this incident is extremely unlikely, and it has been suggested that more likely than not this was a friendly fire incident of some kind. There are regular overflights of Russian positions, or at least not exact overflights, but regularly US reconnaissance and British reconnaissance aircraft fly close to Russian positions, and just possibly someone in the Russian air defense system might have detected these two aircraft on their radar, jumped to the conclusion that they might be American or Western aircraft, and launched some kind of an attack against them, which presumably was curtailed before any great damage was done. I have no idea. I really do not know. I mean, this isn't something I am capable of speculating about to any extent. But anyway, I suspect we're going to get more information over the next couple of days about what actually happened during this incident. I think for the moment, we can say fairly conclusively that the Ilyushin 22 is safe on the ground. The Russian reports are all consistent that the A-50, the Beriev A-50 AWACS aircraft, apparently it is not the more advanced Beriev A50U aircraft. But that's again a claim I'm not able to confirm. But Russian reports are consistent that the Beriev A50 has also successfully landed, and there's even a report circulating that the pilots and crew of both of these aircraft performed with exemplary skill in the face of this kind of attack, and that they're going to be decorated for what they did. And there's even some suggestions that they might be meeting with President Putin himself. If the latter is true, then we will certainly get a Russian account of this whole incident. Now, I am going to say a few things about the way people report these stories. I think it is important when publications report stories like this, especially in the West, not to do what, for example, the Financial Times has done. The Financial Times story, very simple. It simply says that Ukraine has shot down 2 spy aircraft over the Black Sea. You then have to go to the story itself, and there you discover that, in fact, to be precise, the title is Ukraine shoots down 2 Russian spy aircraft in southeast. You have to read the story itself to discover that, in fact, this is simply a Ukrainian claim. I think it is a mistake to do that. We need, from now on, we always need, actually, to understand that when reports like this circulate, one has to wait several hours and days before one establishes the truth. A couple of weeks ago, there were lots of claims, for example, that Ukraine had shot down multiple Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers over Kherson region. Reports spoke about as many as 5 of these aircraft having been shot down. The British Ministry of Defence and the Ukrainians eventually scaled down those claims and claimed that it was 3. There's never been proper confirmation of this, and it's more likely that the number of fighter jets, Sukhoi 34s, that were shot down was just 1. So, we need to wait and get proper information before jumping to conclusions, and we should not report claims of this kind as if they were true. I remember, for example, all kinds of claims circulating at the time when the Moskva was sunk, that it had gone down with all hands, that the entire crew had perished, until, of course, a couple of days later, most of them turned up alive and well, together with their captain, at a parade in, I think it was Sevastopol. So let's hold back and wait and see what has actually happened. Obviously, if the Ukrainians have managed to attack Russian aircraft in the Sea of Azov. Even if they weren't able to shoot them down, then that would be a concerning matter for the Russians. They would want to know how it happened, given, as I said, that the Sea of Azov is supposed to be a safe area for Russian aircraft to operate over. It would suggest that the Ukrainians have been provided with some new piece of equipment with a longer range than the ones we've known about up to now. So, if that is the case, it would be a concerning matter. If a Beriev A-50 had been shot down, it would be a serious matter, though, as I said, Russia does have other aircraft like this. And of course, if these aircraft were damaged or even shot down, or at least in the case of the A-50, as a result of a identification friend and foe failure, then that perhaps would be almost as concerning. They're not perhaps quite as concerning as the first two. The first two possibilities. Ribal has made the point that there's been far too many incidents of this kind on the part of the Russian Air Force and air defense systems over the course of this special military operation for comfort, and that the fact that incidents like this are still happening shows that this problem has not been sorted out, even though, as I mentioned, it had been commented about previously by no less a person than President Putin himself. So anyway, one way or the other, I'm sure there will be a Russian investigation. They'll be looking at what happened, trying to decide what to do. And as they always do, they will come up with solutions for this problem, which will enable them to continue with a special military operation. Anyway, that's all I get to say about this incident. I don't think anything more can be said at the moment. As I said, if we get more information about it, then of course I will come back and I will discuss it. Anyway, let's move on and talk about what else has been happening. And we've been getting more reports now about more damage done to the Ukrainian air defense system and Ukrainian factories as a result of that big Russian missile attack which took place on the 13th of January. And by the way, overnight there was a further combined drone and missile attack on Kharkov. And the Russians do seem to be focusing very heavily on attacks on Kharkov for the moment. And if you do want to believe that a Russian winter offensive in Kharkov region is coming, well, it could be that these attacks on Kharkov are part of the preparation for that. Again, I'm not going to pretend one way or the other that I know. But there was an attack on Kharkov. Again, so far as I can see, all the drones and all the missiles got through. My impression is that mostly the attacks were conducted by drones and perhaps by ground-launched ballistic missiles. It doesn't seem as if hypersonic missiles or air-launched missiles were used. But anyway, whatever, damage to Kharkov does seem to have been done and does appear to be continuing. And in the meantime, as I said, we've been getting more reports, more information about principally damage to Ukrainian factories and industrial facilities spread out across Ukraine as a result of the Russian missile strike on the 13th of January. I would say that it did cross my mind when I first saw those reports coming from the Ukrainians, from General Zelensky specifically, about the shooting down or alleged shooting down of the A-50 the Beriev A-50 AWACS aircraft, and the Ilyushin-22, it did cross my mind that just possibly these reports have been rushed out by the Ukrainians in order to draw attention away from the collapse of Ukraine's air defense system and the fact that the Russians now seem able to strike targets across Ukraine at will, with no sign that the Ukrainians are able to defend against these Russian missile strikes with any degree of effectiveness. To repeat again, Zelensky himself conceded after the attack on the 13th of January that the Ukrainians were only able to shoot down 8 out of the 37 missiles that the Russians launched at Ukraine. A shockingly low total, less than a third of the missiles, a stark contrast to earlier claims in which the Ukrainians were claiming that they were shooting down around 90% of the missiles that the Russians were launching. So that is a dark and negative story, and perhaps after whatever happened on the Sea of Azov, the Ukrainians said to themselves, let's talk up this story, claim that these 2 aircraft were shot down in order to try and draw attention away from the failure of our own air defense system. Or perhaps they tried to mount some kind of ambush against these aircraft on the Sea of Azov, over the Sea of Azov, principally for that same reason, that they needed to provide the Ukrainian people, and more importantly, Ukraine's Western backers, with some good news to make up for the disastrous news of the effects of the Russian missile attack and its success over the previous days. I'm just saying. Anyway, what about the situation on the battlefronts? And here again, it is more of the same. Now, I've seen some of the reports, some of the discussions that have been happening in various places, Syriac and Riba, and all of those people. Mostly they claim, by the way, that the latest story is that the slowing down of Russian offensive moves last week was down to the difficult weather. Maybe that was true. I still incline more to the view that it was basically a Christmas lull. Anyway, that's what they think. You can take whatever view you wish. But it does seem to be the case that the Russians are hammering away, making more advances in the Bakhmut, Avdiivka area, even though, again, less information. There's been less information today, though no doubt we will get more over the course of the next few days and hours. And, we will see what is happening. One area where there has been some information is about what is going on at Krinky. And our old friend, Vladimir Saldo, the Russian governor of Kherson region, claims that over the last week, Ukraine has lost around 200 troops killed or wounded in Krinky. And he said the battle group Neer reports that in the past week, enemies' overall losses in this area exceeded 200 troops, 2 self-propelled and 1 tugged artillery system, 12 mortars, 1 tank, 1 armoured combat vehicle, 1 air defence system, 7 cars, 15 boats, 38 drones, and 19 military infrastructure facilities, depots, observation points, control centres were destroyed. My understanding is that some of these pieces of equipment were in the bridgehead itself on the east bank, others were on the west bank. And then we go on to hear that, according to Saldo, amid the cold spell, flu and respiratory disease rates among Ukrainian soldiers are on the rise. Many have freezing injuries, whilst their evacuation across the Dnieper is practically impossible, with the river freezing over. Numerous cases of freeze burns and necrosis of tissues are reported amongst those taken prisoner. Now, a couple of weeks ago, lots of reports circulating. I remember this is a story that started with Riba, that when the Dnieper froze over, this supposedly would make it easier for the Ukrainians to send supplies to Krinky across the ice. And I expressed significant skepticism about this. I notice that now the story, the view here has changed. This is mainly amongst Russian commentators. Rybo himself, they're coming forward now and saying, on the contrary, that the problem with the ice on the Dnieper is not that it's making it easier to supply Ukrainian troops in Krinky, it is actually making it more difficult. And again, one understands that, certainly my own view, but it would be helpful sometimes if people who had said one thing and now saying something completely different would explain why. And I'll just read what Rebar says about this. He says, there are no significant changes in the Kherson direction. Fighting continues on the islands and in Krinky. The situation for the Ukrainian armed forces in this area continues to worsen every day due to bad weather. The frozen channels of the Dnieper prevent Ukrainian formations from delivering supplies and rotating on time. So, the freezing, the ice is making things more difficult. It is not making things more easy. I'm guessing that people like Riva assumed that the Dnieper would entirely freeze over. It clearly hasn't happened. Doesn't look as if it is going to happen. I suspect that this is too far south, and since we're talking about a river close to the sea, we have a moving body of water, and the sea itself, the sea conditions themselves, are probably contributing to the fact that ice is not building up in the way that people like Rebo perhaps expected earlier. Anyway, Rebo does have it does make one additional claim, which I found intriguing. He says, it is reported that the Ukrainians are able to partially resolve the supply issue. The necessary cargo is delivered by copter, and therefore reports of the evacuation of the Ukrainian garrison in Krinky are still premature. Now that would suggest, if I'm reading that correctly, that Ukrainian helicopters are arriving in Krinky. I have seen no other report that makes that claim, and I would have thought that was an incredibly dangerous and very difficult thing for the Ukrainians to do, and perhaps even an impossible one. More likely, what Riba means here is that the Ukrainians are sending in supplies by drones. But the amount of supplies that could be sent through to Krinky by drones, I would have thought are fairly low. And, well, we've had Saldo. He tells us that 38 drones in this area, Ukrainian drones, have been shot down by the Russians, as well as 15 boats which have been destroyed. One way or the other, and I think this is now widely acknowledged, this Krinky affair has been a disaster. It has not worked out well for the Ukrainians, and, well, maybe they still have plans to advance on Crimea through Kherson region. I talked about that in previous programs, but, well, for the moment at least, it doesn't seem as if this is a viable plan. And with the law on mobilization still stuck in the Ukrainian parliament, and with the Ukrainian army short of men, I would have thought that such an offensive is really impossible now. And I suspect that even someone like President Zelensky has gradually come to understand that. So anyway, my own view is that the proper and correct thing for the Ukrainian military to do, the Ukrainian military and political leadership, if the evacuation of the Ukrainian troops in Krinky is now impossible, I think the correct thing would be to try to arrange a local truce in the area with the Russians, see whether the Russians would agree to the evacuation of these troops to the Ukrainian-controlled west bank of the Dnieper. It's not impossible that the Russians might agree to this. It would resolve the issue of Krinky, and the Russians might want some things in return. Who's to say? They might want some of their people released. But if the Russians didn't agree to this, well, then the most logical thing again is to stop further supplies to Krinky, certainly stop attempts to send reinforcements to Krinky, and to order the troops in Krinky to surrender and to hand themselves over to the Russians. It's important to say that we are not talking about a large force, probably several hundred men at most. So allowing such a surrender, which seems to me to be the only humane thing to do, is not going to significantly impact on Ukraine's military capabilities, and perhaps the Ukrainians might be able to repatriate some of these soldiers in the future through prisoner exchanges. Just saying, I don't expect the Ukrainians to do anything like that. They've never conducted the war at any point in that way. Now, finishing off on this recap of Ukrainian news, there hasn't been a huge amount of news, actually, from the battlefronts, and the stories, therefore, are perhaps dominated by the story about the loss of these two Russian aircraft. But anyway, we have now had that meeting in Davos, which brought together the G7 states, various global south countries, all of them talking about some kind of negotiation process going forward. This is a meeting in Davos, follow-up to the previous unsuccessful meeting in Riyadh. This is part of this process of trying to put together the West, Jake Sullivan, trying to win over the global south to support for President Zelenskys peace plan, which, as I've said many times, is not actually a peace plan. It is a demand for Russia's unconditional surrender, for the Russians to withdraw all their forces from all the areas of Ukraine that they control, including Crimea, and to accept Ukrainian sovereignty over all of these territories. And at that point, the Ukrainians would be prepared to sit down and negotiate, though it is not clear what they would, in that case, be negotiating about. But anyway, this remains the peace plan that the Western powers have been promoting and trying to get the global south to support. And it's fair to say that none of this sequence of meetings, the first of which began in August, have any significant global south countries shown the slightest interest in support for Zelensky's proposal? As I have discussed in the past, this whole series of meetings was launched with that first meeting in August, which was brought together in anticipation of the success of Ukraine's summer counteroffensive. And the fact that the counteroffensive by August, far from succeeding, was very manifestly failing, was in the process, in other words, of being defeated by the Russians, effectively torpedoed this entire process, hold it beyond the waterline. But we've had these meetings, and Davos was the last one, and even Bloomberg is now coming out and reporting that the meeting was a complete failure. Apparently, the only thing anybody could agree about was this time there was some publicity around this meeting. We had a group photograph, and that was the only thing that people could agree to do. In all other respects, the attempts by the Western powers to win over the global south to the Zelensky plan came up against a brick wall. And it is inevitable that they would. Not only does this peace plan not fail to reflect the current realities of the war, the fact that the Russians are obviously winning the war. So, and of course, the previous history of the war, the endless negotiations going back all the way to 2014, the February 21st, 2014 agreement between President Yanukovych and his opponents, which was violated, the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, which failed, and in the case of the Minsk II agreement, which were clearly violated, the Ukrainians coming forward now quite openly and saying that they had no intention of ever implementing the Minsk II agreement, and getting support for that position from people like Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, who were involved in brokering the Minsk agreement in the first place. All of that has soured global South support for the Western position and for Ukraine, because of course they are familiar with the diplomacy, even if the West chooses to look away from it. And of course, going beyond that, they're aware that this plan just doesn't make sense given the military realities on the ground. I don't know whether this Davos process is going to continue, but sooner or later, I suspect it will finally collapse under its own weight. It really doesn't make very, very much sense, and I'm surprised, frankly, that Western governments are continuing to press forward with it. I would add that events in the Middle East since October, the fighting in Gaza, the possible expansion of the war with the missile strikes on Yemen, the threats of a renewed conflict in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, and the very, very strong feelings that global South countries have about these developments, as reflected in the South African claim in the International Court of Justice. All of that cumulatively will have soured support for this process that, as I said, Jake Sullivan initiated back in August, and for the Western views about it even further. Just saying. So, anyway, that has been a failure. There've been, I've noticed, a string of articles and an interview by Boris Johnson trying to distance the Western powers from the collapse of the Istanbul peace agreement. I noticed that David Arahamia, the lead negotiator by Ukraine, who had previously essentially confirmed that the whole negotiation was called off under Western pressure. He's now somewhat retracted on that. But one way or the other, it does, the realities again of this, the multiple admissions by all sorts of people who were involved in that diplomatic process, including previously Arahamia himself, also show the reality, despite Boris Johnson's denials, that in fact it was the Western powers that essentially sabotaged that process. Now, I say all of that. There's been actually quite an interesting interview given by Alexei Arestovich, the now deeply disillusioned former spin doctor of Zelenskys. He's now, by the way, living in the United States. He's no longer in Ukraine. He basically confirms what was agreed in Istanbul. He's given an interview about this, and he says this: it was the most profitable agreement we could have done. That is to say, the negotiators, concluded their two previous agreements that were extremely dangerous for Ukraine, Minsk I and Minsk II. This agreement even contained the question of Crimea. It took 10 years of discussion, 15 years of discussion on the status of Crimea, and it meant security for the Black Sea. But now I don't know, because mid-agreement in Istanbul we came to Kiev, and after BITCHUTE we heard from the president that we had stopped the negotiations. The next meeting was to be on the 9th of April and on the 2nd of April. It was declined, and he goes on to say that what was agreed was not the final agreement. As I've said many times, he says that what was actually agreed was essentially a preliminary agreement, and 90% agreed, and that it opened up the way for a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. They thought that the agreement was successful. We opened the champagne bottle. We had discussed demilitarization, denazification, issues concerning the Russian language, Russian church, and much else. And that month, it was the question of the amount of the Ukrainian armed forces in peacetime. And President Zelensky said, I could decide this question indirectly with Mr. Putin. The Istanbul agreements were a protocol of intentions. Protocol of intentions. In other words, they were heads of agreement, and was 90% prepared for directly meeting with Putin. That was to be the next step of negotiations. I focus on this point because there's been various attempts by various people. There was an article recently in the National Interest to say that the agreement was incomplete, and that meant that there was no real agreement reached in Istanbul. This is, as I've said many times, to misunderstand the nature of the agreement that was reached in Istanbul. It was a heads of agreement, a protocol of intentions. It was 90% agreed. If both sides had confirmed that, there would have been a cessation of hostilities, a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and they would have been able to move forward with the process with the eventual intention of coming to a final agreement. And as I have discussed many times before, the essential agreement was that there would be a ceasefire, that the areas of Donbass and Crimea would be treated separately from the rest of Ukraine. The Russians and the Western powers would provide guarantees for Ukraine minus Crimea and Donbass, and Ukraine would not at that point recognize Crimea and Donbass as either independent or as part of Russia, but there would be negotiations, and Arestovich has given us the timeline, negotiations lasting perhaps a decade or even longer between Ukraine and Russia, over the course of which the final status of Donbass and Crimea would have been resolved. And there would have been all sorts of provisions protecting the status of Russians in Ukraine, and most importantly, Ukraine would have committed not to join NATO. And to repeat again, another narrative point which has become established upon those who want to look away from the situation of what actually happened in Istanbul, who want to deny Western involvement in sabotaging the process, despite, as I said, contrary statements by the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and the Turkish Foreign Minister, Mr. Cavusoglu, and others, including David Arachamia, as I said. What they ignore, they always home in on this arrival by Boris Johnson in Kiev. I think it was on the 7th of April. But what they consistently ignore is that several days before Boris Johnson had actually come to Kiev, he had already telephoned. In fact, he telephoned Zelensky almost as soon as news about the agreement, the Istanbul agreement, circulated. And he made very clear to Zelensky over the course of that telephone conversation that the United Kingdom did not approve or agree with what it appeared had been decided at Istanbul, and was unlikely to agree to provide security guarantees to Ukraine on the basis as set out in that agreement. How do I know that that telephone call by Johnson to Zelensky took place? The reason I know about it is because it was reported at the time by the London Times. So just to clarify all of these things, Global South leaders know all about this. They know about what happened in Minsk I and Minsk II, about the fruitless negotiations that took place, the way the Ukrainians strung along the negotiations without any intention of complying with them, the fact that the Western powers went along with that whole process. They know perfectly well about what happened in Istanbul. Western leaders don't seem to be able to grasp this, and they don't seem to be able to grasp that in terms of negotiations to settle the conflict in Ukraine, Western governments simply lack credibility. Anyway, failure in Davos, I predict, as I said, sooner or later, more countries, more global South countries, are simply going to drift away from this process. The reason, by the way, why this meeting happened in Davos was precisely because it was held on the eve of the WEF's annual meeting in Davos, and that enabled participation in this Davos meeting about Ukraine to be higher than it otherwise would have been, because all sorts of people who probably would have stayed away from this meeting if it had taken place on a standalone basis were already in Davos because they intend to attend the WEF meeting. So that was why Davos was chosen, and that was why the meeting was held when it was. Anyway, that's enough about Ukraine. That's all I really have to say about the situation in Ukraine today. Overall, as I said, continued failure for Ukraine across the battlefronts, negotiations going nowhere for the moment, and this process that the Western powers initiated with this meeting in Davos failing as well, as even Bloomberg is admitting. Elsewhere, situation in the Middle East continues to remain extremely grave. There's been apparently an attempted Houthi missile strike against an American destroyer. The destroyer's air defense systems were able to shoot down the ballistic missile that was launched against this destroyer. I find that a most ominous development indeed. It strongly suggests that the Houthis are going to follow through with their threats to attack Western warships as well as commercial shipping. It seems to me that the escalator that I have been talking about with respect to the situation in the Red Sea, well, it's only going to get worse. And eventually, it's going to start to affect the whole of the Middle East as well. But I will return to that in my next programs or future programs. As I said, for the moment, less news from the Middle East, less news about the other crisis, the other festering crisis, the one around Taiwan. The focus in the United States is now on the presidential election, which is looming over the horizon in November of this year. On the Republican side, much debate about what's going to happen at the Iowa caucuses, widespread assumption that Trump is going to win a landslide victory there. Certainly the opinion polls appear to point in that direction. It would be a very big surprise if that situation were to change. And really concerning articles, worrying articles appearing all across the media, spreading what I have to say, in my opinion, a deeply alarmist claims about what might happen if Donald Trump were first to win the Republican nomination and then were eventually to win the election and the presidency in November. And I have touched on that in previous programs. As I said, I think that some of the claims that have been made, that democracy itself supposedly is in jeopardy if Donald Trump were to win the election, I find this language dangerous in itself. I wonder what it might lead to, how people who might take this sort of rhetoric seriously would react, for example, if Donald Trump were actually to win or even win the Republican nomination. But again, I think that is a topic for discussion in future programs. As for President Biden, there's no sign so far of anybody else standing in for him for the Democratic Party nomination. He continues to show every sign of being determined to stand for re-election in November. I think that the Democrats have probably left the situation too late now to change horses, but then who's to say maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Less news. Of course, if we get more information about those two Russian aircraft, as I said, I'm fairly confident that the Ilyushin-22 has safely landed. I think it more likely than not, significantly more likely than not, that the Beriev A-50 has landed as well. In other words, that neither of these two aircraft have been lost. But anyway, one way or the other, if there is more information about this, then I will discuss it. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. Just to say that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Please also remember to check out, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can check out our shop, find amazing things, magic mugs, hats, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.